You're all very welcome to the Canada Room and Council Chamber. My name is Maurice McCorrig. I am Professor of Politics and Public Policy here at the School of History, Anthropology, Philosophy and Politics, and I'm currently the head of the Politics and International Relations cluster in the school. And it's a huge privilege and honour to welcome you here this evening for our annual Frank Wright lecture, which is something of a high point in the calendar in the year for us. For those of you who don't know who Professor Frank Wright was, he lectured here in Politics at Queen's from 1973 until February 1993, at which point he unfortunately passed away. He had just been seconded to the University of Limerick as the first Professor of Peace Studies at that time, and his work has been enormously influential. His book, Northern Ireland, A Comparative Analysis, explored the local conflict through parallels with other societies divided along ethnic lines, while his important book, Two Lands on One Soil, which was published after his passing in 1994, brought an important, longer historical perspective to the Northern Ireland conflict. And we're extremely delighted to have as a special guest his sister, Dr. Claire Fowler, who's here with us this evening, and who I know some colleagues have known and seen. She comes last year, an unfortunate incident with a flight that she missed, but apart from that, a regular attender. So brilliant that you could be here, Claire. So without further ado, I just want to introduce our speaker here this evening, and we're really, really delighted. He came in on a very late flight from Turkey to be here. So I'm delighted to introduce Professor Seth Schindler from the University of Manchester, where he is Professor of Urban Politics and Development and a geographer by background, as we were discussing. He's a leading scholar of urban politics and development, focusing on how global political and economic transformations shape cities, particularly in the global south. His work examines the reconfiguration of urban spaces through large-scale infrastructure projects, south-to-south cooperation and shifting geopolitical alignments. He's contributed to critical debates on state capitalism, deindustrialization, and the emerging geopolitical order shaped by US-China rivalry. And I have to say, when I saw that, I thought, this is the guy for this lecture. I thought this is really timely. And the consequences of the latter on global networks of infrastructure, digital technologies, production, and finance. He co-founded, as you can see here in the bottom left, the Second Cold War Observatory, which is a global research network exploring how renewed geopolitical tensions affect people and places worldwide. So very much in the spirit of Frank Wright's efforts to internationalise understandings of local conflict, Seth's research reveals how place-based struggles are embedded in wider global processes, exposing the politics and the uneven geographies of development, dispossession and resistance. So I'm very much looking forward to his lecture now, titled Geopolitical Rivalry in a Networked World. So thank you, Seth.
Thank you very much, Maurice. It's really a pleasure to be here. Thank you for the invitation. And thank you for taking the time. I know everyone is extremely busy, so it's nice of you to turn up. It's an honor to be giving the Frank Wright Memorial Lecture 2025, and I think I will be speaking to some themes that may have interested him: localization of conflict, geopolitics. The talk will be transscalar, how some of these big, large global events manifest locally. But I'm going to start. I'm going to make the argument today that the US-China rivalry amounts to a second Cold War, whose geopolitical imperative is to control global networks, the transnational networks that underpin globalization and that many people anticipate will be a source of power well into the 21st century. To this end, the US and China are engaged at the moment in a renegotiation of globalization as we know it. So that's the kind of core message that I want to give today. And to illustrate the novelty of contemporary geopolitical rivalry, I'm going to give a very quick recap of the Cold War, which I think everyone is familiar with, but I'm going to compare a few points that are worth comparing to illustrate, again, the novelty of geopolitical rivalry today and the post-Cold War era. And then I'm going to turn to examine the response to contemporary geopolitics of third countries and firms and how they're shaping this rivalry before I turn to a mini case study to try and put everything together. So this was taken at Yalta, the Yalta Conference, 1945, when victory was imminent, and the Allies got together to divide the world, basically, and establish spheres of influence. What's really interesting is the note on the right. That was a note that was made in a secret pre-conference meeting between Churchill and Stalin. And they basically got together and said, all right, well, you can have 80% of this, I'll have 20% of that. And this then informed the talks at Yalta, unbeknownst to Roosevelt at the time. What's interesting here is that they agreed on spheres of influence rather than political blocks, which is what would happen, right, a few years later. And I think that's illustrated by the agreement that Churchill and Stalin made, because, for example, here you see Romania. This is going to be 90% controlled by the Soviets, 10% controlled by Britain. Who knows how that would have worked in practice? But the idea was that these were spheres of influence rather than hardened territorial blocks. When the Korean War broke out, those spheres of influence, everything changed. They became zero-sum, hardened borders. There was an East and a West bloc. Stalin understood full well. He understood more than anyone else, I think, what was at stake. And in the final days of World War II, he said, this war, World War II, is not like in the past. Whoever occupies a territory also imposes on it his own social system. Everyone imposes his own social system as far as his army has power to do so. It cannot be otherwise. And so that's what happened within these territorial blocks. These blocks were semi-autarkic. Both sides sought to expand their respective bloc at the expense of the other, of their rivals. This was typically through a coup d'etat or a revolution. And the Cold War was therefore a very long, 4+ decades, renegotiation of the agreement that was reached at the Yalta Conference, with the border shifting accordingly, in accordance with kind of small victories, coups, revolutions, and so on. Territory, importantly, was the currency that was traded here in this renegotiation. So for the US, of course, for 4 decades, the cornerstone of its foreign policy was containment of communism. This was very, very much territorial. The domino theory is probably something everyone is familiar with. This changed over time. Some people advocated a perimeter defense. Other people said that you should focus on strong points and protect those instead. But the idea of containment, again, this animated US foreign policy for 4 decades. And the Soviets were themselves afraid of capitalist encirclement, so also very territorial, right? The situation all but guaranteed that the great powers would be drawn into civil wars and regional conflicts, which they interpreted through the lens of this Cold War geopolitics, so the US and Vietnam, Soviets in Afghanistan. We can think of many Cold War flashpoints. Everything changed then with the sudden and surprise end of the Cold War, and the world witnessed the emergence of an entirely new form of geopolitics. So the international order that had obtained in the West was expanded globally, and this entailed the proliferation of multilateral agreements and institutions and the integration of markets. In other words, globalization as we know it, or if you prefer, neoliberal globalization. So a host of institutional reforms and incentives were introduced to enable and encourage these and other multinational corporations to move across national borders, easily look for cheap factors of production, places with amenable institutions where they could produce. And this gave rise to what we call global production networks. John Harrison at Loughborough explained, quote, "Capital is freeing itself from the shackles of historically entrenched, nationally scaled regulatory systems, which had kept capital accumulation contained within and constrained by territorially demarcated national economies during the epoch of Fordist industrial growth." In short, these territorial production systems were unbundled, opened up, and firms went out and were incentivized to create global production networks. Now, they started experimenting with offshoring and outsourcing in the 1960s. So a company like Fairchild Semiconductor set up production facilities in Hong Kong, but this was very much within the firm's structure, and it remained vertically integrated. What we see in the 1990s and 2000s is a proliferation of outsourcing, where firms like multinational corporations, the ones here, start to become completely, well, they don't really produce anything, right? They just coordinate these vast networks of suppliers. If you think of Apple, the production for Apple is done by Foxconn and Luxshare, and they themselves source products and components from hundreds, if not thousands, of suppliers, right? So the dissolution of the USSR and the rapprochement between the US and China meant that this era was devoid of great power politics, but there was a geopolitics at work in this era. So the imperative of geopolitics in this time was to integrate states into these transnational networks that were taking shape. It was assumed that only through integration could threats be neutralized by the sheer power of markets, right? Markets and leveraging power within them was how you disciplined malign actors. So Susan Roberts, Anne Secor, and Matt Spark refer to this as neoliberal geopolitics. And this mapism is from their 2003 article of the same title. And it draws on discussions and an analysis of documents that they did of kind of national security type folks, Army War College, Naval War College, this kind of thing. And what they show is these people came up with this scheme of a functioning core. This core is interconnected. Then beyond the core, you've got, this is a boundary of they call it the non-integrating gap. Again, these are the national security folks coming up with these terms. Don't focus on the map too much because it doesn't make any sense. I mean, why is Turkey a member of NATO in beyond the core? Who knows? The point is rather that you have this integrated core, and beyond that is this non-integrated space. And in order to reduce the threat posed by that non-integrated space, you have to expand global networks and connect it, right? So this is from Susan Roberts et al. In this era, neoliberal geopolitics, they say, quote, danger is no longer imagined as something that should be contained at a disconnected distance. Now, by way of complete counterpoint, danger is itself being defined as disconnection from the global system. This was popularized by Thomas Friedman. You might have heard of his golden arches theory. So he's a journalist, he writes for the New York Times still. And he had this notion of the golden arches theory, which is he points out that no two countries with McDonald's ever fought a war together against one another. And that has nothing to do with McDonald's. Rather, supposedly, once you have a McDonald's, you've crossed into this threshold of being interconnected with the global economy. And you won't risk those connections by starting a war with your neighbor to, like, I don't know, take over a small bit of territory like the Donbass, for example. So globalization and neoliberal geopolitics constituted in this era a kind of meta-context. And nowhere was this more evident than in the relationship between the US and China. Their economies had become deeply integrated in ways that made them interdependent on one another, right? Their responses to the global financial crisis in 2008 were not coordinated, but they were very complementary. And according to Adam Tooze, it showed that they really constituted a G2, right? I mean, the world turned on the decisions made in both Beijing and Washington. However, the global financial crisis also revealed something else about this period, about globalization, a downside to their relationship. Perhaps globalization writ large as well. That downside bred significant discontent in both countries among certain segments of the population. Now, in the US, this was initially concentrated among working class communities that experienced extreme deindustrialization after the rapprochement of the US and China, and in this period of globalization, for obvious reasons. As I just noted, companies started offshoring, and so you had rapid decline in certain communities. This was popularized by David Autor and colleagues as the China shock. Because it was published in the NBER, this is where economists publish these kinds of things, it was kind of suddenly got a lot of attention. But this was not news to anyone from Detroit, where I'm from, right? I mean, everyone knew that their communities had been hollowed out when factories moved overseas. Importantly, in the wake of the crisis, the 2008 crisis, Chinese firms became very assertive with their erstwhile partners. So there were a lot of joint ventures, right? If you were an American multinational, you would outsource, you would maybe set up something, work together with someone like Foxconn or Luxshare if you're Apple, and produce your iPhones there. But American firms and other Western firms started complaining that their Chinese partners were becoming really assertive. China was becoming an inhospitable place to do business, and they complained of intellectual property theft and so on. Now, there's a big debate about this, but you don't have to really take sides. I think the important thing that Ho-Fung Hung, some of you might know at Johns Hopkins, he points out that what's very clear is that this is a perception among multinationals that they can't really be doing business in China the way they used to. And so, taken together, the alienation of American labor on the one hand, together with the more recent alienation of American capital, led to a reappraisal of US-China policy. And in the years after the financial crisis, we see this reappraisal play out, which I think we all know what happens. I'll get to that in a moment. But the crisis signaled also that to China and to Chinese folks that its unprecedented growth, this growth episode, unprecedented in human history, was sputtering. And social mobility, this kind of era of rapid social mobility, which, let's not forget, social classes were, social inequality was reduced significantly during the Cultural Revolution, and then you get this era of reform and opening up. So you get this rapid era of over a decade of double-digit growth per year and social mobility, that may be coming to an end. And there was a backlash. It's important to note that China's integration with the US and its accession to the World Trade Organization was very controversial in China. So we might forget that, or we might assume that's not the case, because you think to yourself, well, China was a big winner of globalization, right? That's true, but there was an old guard that throughout this period opposed partnering with the US and opposed opening up and giving any concessions to the World Trade Organization. So Zhu Rongji, who some of you might be familiar with, he was their primary negotiator, an associate of Wen Jiabao, and he was kind of treated as almost like a traitor in some circles, in some of the more Maoist circles, the hardline group within the Communist Party clique of that side of the political spectrum. By 2008, the party faced a real legitimacy crisis. So protests were really common in this period, right? I mean, workers demanded job security, better wages, better working conditions. As you may know, mobility is restricted around China. You need a kind of, you need hoku, which is almost like a permission to move from one place to another. If you live in a place without that permission, you might be able to work there, but you can't take advantage of any social services like send your kids to school. So there were protests from workers. Then peasants protested over land, access to land. This was very common. And throughout this period, you had this increasingly cozy relationship between the Communist Party and business elites. So Jack Ma, who you might know, this kind of mercurial founder of Alibaba, who advocates that his workers work 996, 12, that's kind of work from 9 a.m. to 9 p.m., 6 days a week. And that's how you get ahead in modern day China, according to Jack Ma. Well, he's a card-carrying member of the Communist Party. So that's rather odd, right? So for these people that were these kind of old guard, that just didn't work. I mean, the party, if he's a card-carrying member, then what is the purpose of the party when peasants don't have access to land? And so you had this major backlash. Add to this a leadership struggle between Xi Jinping and Bo Xilai, who some of you may have heard of. He was in charge of Chongqing, and he would, it's a major city in the interior. And he kind of, both of them recognized the importance of this discontent. And Bo Xilai would establish these rallies that were reminiscent of Mao era, Cultural Revolution era period. And so to make a long story short, after this leadership struggle and after taking over, Xi Jinping set about restoring the party's legitimacy through this notion of the China dream, and both he and Donald Trump launch these large-scale programs that are backward-looking, whose aim is to restore an imagined past that probably didn't really exist, at least in the form that they presented. This necessitated a break with the policies that had underpinned their partnership, what some people have called chimerica, or not even partnership, just the relationship between them, their interdependence. In the US, this could only come from someone who is outside the political order, right? If Jeb Bush or Hillary Clinton had won in 2016, they're so deeply integrated into the political order, they were accounted for, right? They would not have introduced the sweeping changes that Trump had introduced in his campaign to make America great again. At the same time, given Chinese politics, such a project could only be launched from deep within the political order, from someone at its apex, i.e. Xi Jinping, and he promised to finally achieve what he calls national rejuvenation. I'm not going to talk about Make America Great Again because I think all of you are probably pretty familiar with it, and I'm afraid we just talk about Trump all the time, unfortunately, and we're sick of it. But so I'm going to talk a little bit about national rejuvenation. This is an old term that you can find in CCP, in Chinese Communist Party documents that predates the revolution and independence. And basically, the 2021 history, the official history of the party, released by the party itself, says that you've got this kind of 30-year period of Mao, and then this 30-year period after Mao, and now we're in a completely new period with Xi. And he's going to kind of integrate these two. Both of these periods were necessary. That's important because you kind of, if you're writing for the CCP, you want to validate both periods. You want to say, yeah, Mao was great, but this other period was also great. And how do you explain that? Well, you say they're both necessary components that Xi Jinping will then use and harness the good aspects of both of them and take you to the next level and finally achieve national rejuvenation. So I'm going to read something from that official history. It's only the third of such histories that the party has ever released. The overarching task of upholding and developing socialism with Chinese characteristics is to realize the socialist modernization and national rejuvenation, and that on the basis of completing the goal of building a moderately prosperous society in all respects. A two-step approach should be taken to build China into a great, modern, socialist country that is prosperous, strong, democratic, culturally advanced, harmonious, and beautiful by the middle of the 21st century, and to promote national rejuvenation through a Chinese path to modernization. Well, sounds good. It goes on. Today, we are closer, more confident, and more capable than ever of realizing the goal of national rejuvenation. But at the same time, all party members must realize that achieving national rejuvenation will be no walk in the park, and it will take more than drum beating and gong clanging to get there. There are many risks and challenges on the journey ahead, some of which we can foresee and others we cannot. But the message then is, don't worry, Xi Jinping is the leader to help us navigate those challenges. So these projects, again, they're backward-looking, they're restorative, but importantly, they're mutually exclusive. If you dig into the details of both, you will see that Trump cannot make America great again in the way that he envisions that if Xi Jinping achieves what he intends to achieve with national rejuvenation. So they're mutually exclusive. Importantly, also, neither can be achieved without globalization, as we know it. And that is why I argue neither leader embraces deglobalization. However, they seek to renegotiate its terms and their relationship. So, to this end, their rivalry is, they would both like to avoid complete decoupling and in a way that would perhaps result in kind of an extremely fragmented world. Instead, they're competing for network control, for control of the key networks that constitute globalization and underpin it. These are the transnational networks that they believe, again, will underpin power in the 21st century. This is finance, certain production networks such as semiconductors, EVs, batteries, and so on, that would go all the way back from the rare earth minerals to consumer markets. Digital, that includes hardware and software, so these are kind of Alibaba versus Google, as well as the geography of undersea internet cables, for example, and infrastructure that will make all of this happen. These are port networks and so on, which I'll talk about in a moment. So how does one achieve network centrality and exercise control over these transnational networks? Just think of the US for a minute. This is an entirely new challenge. During the Cold War, it was preparing for a territorial conflict and sought to contain the USSR, but given its interdependence with China, it's unclear what a strategy of containment would really look like, right? You're trying to control networks, not control territory. This was not lost on Mike Pompeo. He was the foreign secretary under Donald Trump the first term. He said, quote, "This is not about containment. Don't buy that. It's about a complex new challenge that we have never faced before. This USSR was closed off from the free world. Communist China is already within our borders." Okay, so you can't do containment. And then the last strategy, which I mentioned during the post-Cold War era, the imperative there in neoliberal geopolitics was to connect, right? To connect more deeply. It was through connection that you could render threatening, malign actors more peaceful and control them. However, now there's a general recognition that interdependence can be weaponized, right? It also creates vulnerabilities. So nobody in Washington suggests that integrating with China more deeply is a solution. The 2017 National Security Strategy repudiated this neoliberal geopolitics. I quote, "These competitions with great powers require the United States to rethink the policies of the past 2 decades, policies based on the assumption that engagement with rivals and their inclusion in international institutions and global commerce would turn them into benign actors and trustworthy partners. For the most part, this premise turned out to be false." So you can't do the Cold War strategy of containment. You can't do the post-Cold War strategy of engagement and connecting. What do you do? Both, again, the US and China seek to then control network connections. These are the nodes, the flows, the connections in between. But this is very challenging because control is ephemeral. An incoming president can just cancel the contract of a port, as China Merchant Holdings Company found out in Tanzania. The previous government signed a deal for a $10 billion port, Africa's largest, by the way. A new president just said, sorry, this is extravagant, we don't need it, I don't like these terms, we're not doing that. Likewise, legislators can decide, as they did in this country, to just remove Huawei from digital networks, right? So you can have a victory in one corner of the network, but these are global, transnational networks that your victory can be reversed quite quickly. On the other hand, even if it's not, it can be offset elsewhere by your rival's victory, right? And so Cold War geopolitics, if that was like a kind of game of dominoes where countries could cascade from one camp to another, one bloc to another, this is entirely different. This is nothing like that. It's more like a game of whack-a-mole where you're just responding all over the map from one network to another constantly. The reason then is because in the context of globalization, states have been cut across by all of these transnational networks, and many are deeply connected to both the US and to China in a myriad of ways. How does that influence the response? Well, many countries during the Cold War sought to be non-aligned. This is Sukarno, the first prime minister of Indonesia, and he hosted the meeting in Bandung of non-aligned, which became non-alignment, the non-aligned movement in 1955. He outlined the parameters of what would later be the kind of core principles of non-alignment in his opening speech. And for him, it was first and foremost about keeping the great powers, the US and Soviet Union, at arm's length. He said, "Great chasms yawn between the nations and groups of nations. that not only threaten our independence, but mean the end of civilization and even of human life. He acknowledged that African and Asian nations, quote, wield little physical power. We cannot indulge in power politics. These were countries that were recently independent, and if they got involved in these great power politics, he feared that they would lose their agency and they would kind of be forced into relations of dependence with one great power or another. If they could stay above the fray of great power rivalry and show, quote, to the minority of the world which lives on other continents that we, the majority, are for peace, not for war. Sukarno thought that this was the key to non-alignment. Only by remaining aloof from geopolitics and great power rivalry could these countries both safeguard their hard-won independence and also be a force for reason and prevent another world war. Well, let's compare that with what world leaders are saying today. First, the main message that they're saying is that they don't want to choose between the US and China. Senegal's former Prime Minister Macky Sall said, quote, Africa has suffered enough. It does not want to be the breeding ground of a new Cold War, but rather a pole of stability and opportunity open to all its partners on a mutually beneficial basis. Similarly, when campaigning, I don't know about campaigning, but before he was Prime Minister in Singapore, Lawrence Wong was interviewed by The Economist, and they said, are you pro-China or are you pro-US? And he thought about it for a moment and he said, we are pro-Singapore. And I think that sums up pretty much what many leaders think, including Indonesia's current president, Prabowo Subianto. He said, we invite the US, the Japanese, the Koreans, the Europeans. The fact that we are friends with you doesn't mean we can't be friends with China, India, Russia. We're open for business, is basically what he was saying. Now, these leaders seek to defend the connections that they forged in this period of globalization. In other words, rather than remaining non-aligned and keeping the US and China at arm's length, they want to connect with both, right? The two largest markets in the world. Who doesn't? And they want to protect those connections. So, take Turkey. I flew from Turkey yesterday. Its firms are deeply integrated with the European Union production networks. Its finance system is integrated with Wall Street. It's a member of NATO. It buys Russian gas. It formally aligned its national spatial strategy with China's Belt and Road project, which you may have heard of in 2018. With whom is Turkey not aligned, right? It's not non-aligned. It's what my colleagues and I call polyaligned. And so it's this polyalignment is kind of the new non-alignment in the Second Cold War. Even a country like the UK that is ostensibly aligned with the United States, it exhibits a degree of polyalignment. So the decision to remove Huawei from telecoms networks, although that's far more challenging than anyone anticipated, that signaled an intention to align digital networks with the United States, right, in Silicon Valley. At the same time, the City of London is a center of the international trade of the Chinese currency. So the internationalization of RMB. And it intends to go further. It wants to be the primary center where you can trade this currency abroad. So the financial network is far more polyaligned, is the point. This is not a case, as some scholars would claim, of hedging, whereby countries have a single clear set of interests, they're rational actors, they're waiting for an opportune moment to decide, to jump off the fence and decide who they really want to align with. Instead, there are a host of public and private interest groups with competing interests, right? Some would prefer to orient themselves towards China, others towards the US. The executive's role in all of this seems to be to throw up their hands, like Subianto, and say, look, I don't know, just don't make us choose, right? And so now what about firms? They're the other main actors. We said if the Cold War is about territory, who controls territory? Sovereign states. If the current moment is one in which the US and China are competing to control networks, who controls networks? As the slide I showed with all of those multinational corporations, it's firms, right? After all, they're the ones that established these networks in the era of neoliberal globalization. They became the architects of these networks. Now, there are all firms seek to reduce their exposure to geopolitical risk. All firms seek to reduce their exposure to geopolitical risk. And they do that in a number of ways. So one firm introduced, or a couple of firms have introduced these organizational changes where the Chinese part is made a separate legal entity from the other parts. Others have introduced changes to their production process. So we see a tendency towards more vertical integration. That is, things that were subcontracted and outsourced are being brought back into the firm just to give you a bit more control over them. But I think together with Steve Rolfe, a colleague, and I, we published an article in Globalizations. We argue that the first distinction that has to be made is firms that try to remain aloof from geopolitics and other firms that lean into it. And the reason is very clear. Intel is a rather lagging firm. They produce the chips in our laptops. That's it's a pretty small market these days. It's not very dynamic. The dynamic market in semiconductors is for the real high-end chips that are doing AI, or these like more advanced, smaller chips in iPhones and other handsets. The laptop chip market is not particularly dynamic. And so Intel has struggled. They, I think, saw the opportunity to obtain subsidies in the CHIPS Act and the EU CHIPS Act as a chance to reverse their ailing fortunes. And in order, though, to obtain these subsidies, which are really given because there are geostrategic interests behind them, right? To kind of, we talked, when the EU CHIPS Act resulted in them agreeing to build a semiconductor factory in Magdeburg in Sachsen-Anhalt in Germany. They signed the documents, and then at the ceremony, one of the German politicians said, like, this is, something about the sovereignty, this is going to safeguard the sovereignty of Europe. So there's a national security logic behind these subsidies and these industrial policies. Of course, if you want to obtain that funding, you kind of have to lean into that to a certain extent. And so that's the game Intel has played. Apple has played a very different game, and they've always sought to remain aloof from geopolitics. And they kind of give this impression that they effortlessly connect US and China, and this makes no difference to them, and they're neutral and they're above the fray. However, quietly, Apple has also tried to introduce measures that would reduce its exposure to geopolitical risk. So, in, I think it was 2020 or 2021, they had to face down a motion from shareholders that would have forced them to divest from communist China, which is just not possible if you're Apple at that time. Marco Rubio, at that time a senator for Florida, told them, "You're playing with fire." But actually, they were busy rearranging their supply chain. So its long-term fixed capital in China peaked in 2018 at 13.2 billion, and by 2023, it had decreased to 5.7 billion. So it was slowly making investments elsewhere and allowing its capital goods in China to degrade. And just last week, it said it will now shift production to India. So even Apple was no longer, the heat is just too high. It was no longer able to just maintain this fantasy that it could remain aloof from these things. So, all right, the US-China competition to control transnational networks, it's this novel meta-context that conditions the behavior of firms, of states, and how do we make sense of this? I mean, how would you study that, right? I mean, this is the challenge that colleagues and I in the Second Cold War Observatory have had. Should you just study a single sector like electric vehicles or semiconductors? Should you look at one actor, a firm? Should you examine how states respond, a single state? Look at how it manifests in a place. How do we account for the multidimensionality and transscalar nature of contemporary geopolitical rivalry? This is the big question, I think. I don't have a single concise answer, but I will offer a brief case that shows how these elements can be brought together and grounded in a single place, okay? So, the BRI, the Belt and Road Initiative, I hope you have some knowledge of that. It's a scheme to kind of build these large-scale transnational infrastructure networks that radiate outward from China. And there's been a lot of research on this. These would be like railway networks that would, for example, connect China to Europe via Russia, Kazakhstan, Belarus, and so on. So it was introduced by Xi Jinping in 2013, and within 5 years, Francis Fukuyama, who you might know as having inaugurated the end of history, he and colleagues lamented that the West had, quote, surrendered the field of global infrastructure development to China. However, very interestingly, the BRI went unnoticed when it was first introduced. So it didn't appear in the Financial Times until 2015, 2 years after its introduction. And then there was some bland statements that were just relayed without any sort of analysis. It says, quote, Standard Chartered analysis stress it's primarily a program focused on building infrastructure, including ports, roads, railways, and oil pipelines in the poorer parts of China and countries along the Silk Road. Okay, so nothing to see here according to the Financial Times. The next year, it debuted in Foreign Affairs, but the author was critical of Western governments for ignoring it. He said, quote, Congress has not had a single hearing dedicated to the BRI. Neither has the U.S.-China Economic and Security Review Commission, a body that Congress created in 2000 to monitor bilateral trade and security issues. At both the 2015 and 2016 meetings of the U.S.-China Strategic and Economic Dialogue, the highest-level annual summit held between the two countries, U.S. and Chinese officials detailed more than 100 areas of potential cooperation without mentioning the BRI once in their public statements. So the narrative is that this is a great program. It's just meant to kind of fill in the gaps of infrastructure, enhance connectivity. Why isn't anyone talking about this? But all of this suddenly changed by the next year. And it wasn't possible to find anyone with anything positive to say about the Belt and Road Initiative. So you see a proliferation of things coming out, and particularly about ports, the growing network of Chinese ports is owned and operated by Chinese firms. Now, the two that got the most attention were Hambantota Port in Sri Lanka. This is because it's usually given as an example of what some people call debt trap diplomacy. Now, I disagree with that assessment for a number of reasons we could get into in the Q&A if you'd like, but the idea is that China loans someone like Sri Lanka money to build a port. They can't pay it back, so they have to forfeit the port, and this is a kind of clever way for China to take control of the infrastructure. That's the narrative anyway. The other port that got the most attention was Piraeus Port here in Athens. This is a photo I took. I'm doing research with John Silver and Yanis Kilianos, both at the University of Sheffield. And here in Athens, a Chinese entity, Costco, initially leased in 2009 a large portion of the port, and then it subsequently purchased a majority stake. So it's the owner then. Importantly, this was encouraged by the Troika, the European powers that were advising Greece on how to handle the kind of the fallout of the crisis. You privatize all your infrastructure. If a Chinese firm wants to come along and buy a port, all the better. So how has this precipitated conflict over networks with the US? Through this, we can see a number of ways that the US responded that I think show kind of how these dynamics play out at different scales in a variety of ways. So the main way that the US responded was to reduce Costco's network power at multiple scales. And I'll explain what I mean by that. First, at the regional scale, I guess you could say, or transnational scale, the US, in collaboration with India, announced IMEC, the India, Middle East, Europe Economic Corridor in 2023 at the G20 summit in New Delhi. So this is supposed to be a kind of rival of the Belt and Road Initiative. So if you're going to the idea would be that in one of the Belt and Road Initiatives, the Eurasian Land Bridge, it's one of these infrastructure corridors. You go from China through Kazakhstan, Russia, Belarus, and then you'd enter the European Union in Poland at a small town called Majasevice. Instead of doing that, you can just go from India through the Persian Gulf, through Israel and Palestine, and then land at the European Union in Greece. So remember, I just noted that Apple is going to build its iPhones in India. This could be potentially a way to get them to Europe. Well, all right, this was introduced to much fanfare, but I assume some of you are probably thinking, Seth, this makes no sense. There's a war going on. Can you actually build an infrastructure corridor through a war zone? Well, according to the Greek Prime Minister, you sure can. Why not? So let's proceed with the IMEC despite the Gaza war. This Mitsotakis was visiting Modi in India the same time that we were conducting research in Athens, interestingly. So apparently this is not a problem. But this effort to remake transnational logistics networks, it's very difficult. Already Turkey has said there will be no corridor without Turkey. If you notice, that kind of bypasses Turkey. So there are a lot of politics that go into this that are beyond or in addition to the US-China rivalry. However, this effort to remake transnational logistics networks, it's complemented by another effort of the US that's more localized to build redundancy and reduce the network power that is enjoyed by COSCO. So first, before I explain that, you have to know what the Development Finance Corporation is. This was introduced in the BUILD Act. It was a law passed by Biden, and basically the idea was that it would kind of put up some capital for large-scale infrastructure projects, and then private capital could make up the difference, and that would allow the US to compete with China's Belt and Road Initiative. It hasn't worked very well. Interestingly, when US aid was, well, canceled, I guess, and disbanded, the Development Finance Corporation stayed around. Daniela Gabor has an excellent article about this in Phenomenal World. It's just business as usual over at the Development Finance Corporation. And you'll note that they introduced a project. It says the Development Finance Corporation commits $125 million to modernize Elefsina shipyard in Greece, establish critical energy supply hub in the Mediterranean. The explanation of this, it explains that you've got the port that it's going to build, I'll show you on a map, as well as an LNG terminal. So the LNG terminal will allow American tankers taking LNG from Texas and elsewhere in the Permian Basin to southern Europe. And this is a substitute for the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, of course. So with this investment here in Athens, you have kind of a geopolitical rationale that counters both China and Russia. And what is going on there? So here you see Piraeus port, and here you see where the shipyards will be built. What this means, in my assessment, and again, this is collaborative research with colleagues, but right now, COSCO has a kind of choke point, right? In the event of some sort of geopolitical upheaval, you could potentially close off this route, or at least you could close it off to certain users, right? Like US military ships a lot of things privately. When you build port infrastructure just a couple of kilometers from here, it's no longer a choke point. So this is quite interesting. I think this shows how it's so different from the Cold War. If the Soviet Union had a port somewhere, first of all, that's unthinkable. The US would have not allowed that or tried to get them out of there, right? Now it's fine. COSCO can be in Piraeus, but what the US does not want it to have is the power to exercise any power over a choke point, right? To be have network power. It can be an economic actor that moves containers around, that's fine. But it's by building that other port there to the north where the X is, it's reduced its network power. It will take a while. This is from this picture was taken here where the X is, and it will take some time, but it's quite interesting. Recently, this was just in January, the US blacklisted COSCO which operates the Greek port, and all that means is that it cannot be contracted by US government entities, and anyone who's working with the US military can't use COSCO. So you're kind of ensuring that there's going to be demand for the new port infrastructure when it's built. Of course, now Greece is a transit point, or was a transit point when US was sending a lot of material to Ukraine, and then there are big NATO operations going on there as a staging post and so on. But anyway, so I want to wrap up here, and I just want to draw attention to the fact that many of these ideas were developed collaboratively with colleagues in the Second Cold War Observatory. If you want to know more about what we're up to or see some of we have a podcast and original articles, you can see at the secondcoldwarobservatory.com. And once again, I'd just like to thank you for coming along today, and thank you for your attention.